everybody.
Hello.
Hello.
Can you hear us? We mic'd up? Great. All right, so what do you want to talk about?
So we're here to talk about ChatGPT and AI and the future of writing. We're curious how many people in the room have actually tried out ChatGPT. Oh, wow. It's
A lot.
A lot. So I kind of had this idea to understand what ChatGPT is if you're not really familiar with the technology underlying it. And so I'm going to volunteer some people in the front row. I am going to start a sentence, and then you will continue it word by word until we reach the end of the sentence. So are you okay with that? Okay, the cow
went over the moon.
you did it all, but went over the moon. So this is kind of how the ChatGPT works. When I said the cow, the obvious way to finish that sentence is went over the moon or jumped over the moon. And basically these technologies have been trained on lots of writing, mostly scraped from the internet, in order to figure out what word comes next. And so after the cow, you're going to do jumped or went over the moon. And that is essentially the simple version of what we're working with.
Yeah, I think, Jeffrey Hinton, who was one of the creators of this, kind of described it as being a sort of autocomplete technology taken to the nth degree. And that nth degree, I think, becomes more and more nth as time goes on, or at least that's the idea with generative AI. So in some ways, it's a simple tool that scales up almost, in this infinitesimal way that obviously is concerning to many people.
Yeah, I was asking you guys before we started, are you among the authors? My book came out more recently, came out in September.
Yeah.
But you have books that have been around longer. Has your work been kind of used to train some of these models?
Well, I asked ChatGPT, I was feeling lazy one day, and I needed to write something that was actually not public facing. It was more for a publisher or a movie company. And I thought that would be a good way to test this because it's not something that's going to be put out in the public. So if it accidentally plagiarized or did something terrible, I wouldn't be in trouble for it. So this was my experiment. I asked it to write a draft of a summary of a film that I was making that hadn't been made yet. And I told it what the film was about. And it actually did a pretty good job of describing what the unmade film that I would make would be. Actually, it was terrifying because it did it in 1 second. And then I read it again, and I thought, well, actually, it's not that great. But it's pretty good, considering it's a machine. So then I asked it to rewrite the summary of the film that was not made by me in the style of me. And it actually did a much worse job. Which I thought was actually quite telling, that meant that it hadn't really absorbed my body of work. And I'm a writer as well, so I then asked it to write the proposal in the style of my writing, and I gave it some hints, like as appeared in Vanity Fair, and it did an even worse job. So what that meant to me is that the next versions will obviously be better. It hadn't ingested my work yet. I wasn't actually famous enough for it to really know what my films were. So I think that's a good barometer of where we are with this. However, I then rewrote rewrote the material and made it better and made it more my style, and it probably saved me 20 minutes of work. So that's my kind of summary of where we are with like version 4 of this. But I think this is nothing. I think we're really at just the precipice of something. And what I would wonder about is sentience, and I'm no expert in this actually, so Kash, I'll throw that back to you, and, because I think we have to talk about that. But the one other thing I think I can reasonably contribute off the top of my head is that I write about architecture, and when AutoCAD, which was the computer that would help architects design buildings, came about 20 years ago, I was asking architects, well, what's this going to do with your creativity? And there was like great high dudgeon, and I think this is actually a comp that happened a generation before. And they said that AutoCAD, which is a design tool that draws a building as a computerized aid, was a tool and only a tool, and that it would not actually take the creativity out of the hands of the architect. It would in fact increase the creativity. And I think the great exemplar of that, where that has actually panned out, is Frank Gehry, because Frank Gehry's buildings are so complicated, he actually couldn't design them without that tool. There wouldn't be no Bilbao, there would be no Disney Hall without that tool. And Frank Gehry, I think, has only become more creative and more enabled by it. So that's a comp for me as a non-computer science person who is confronting, I think, the equivalent of that, at least in the short term.
Matt, I just want to say, I think that's really interesting because as someone who also writes about architecture and design, I know a lot of architects who do use AutoCAD as a tool for completing designs, but the core creative act tends to be very separate from that. And in the case of Frank Gehry, the core creative act of design is often taking a piece of paper and maybe crumbling the piece of paper. It's weird talking about Frank Gehry because I think he's somewhere here today or tomorrow.
Oh, really?
But yeah, because there's such a kind of a sculptural element to his design process. He'll take a piece of paper, crumble it this way, that way, do some origami, and then it might be up to somebody else in the Gehry studio to figure out how to make that a reality, and that's where AutoCAD comes in to create a sort of an actionable architectural plan. Other architects I know are still very, very grounded in pencil and sketching. And I guess what I'm trying to say is that in the way in which AI, generative AI, ChatGPT, these things can kind of inch closer to the core creative act, then you start to get into the territory where it's certainly concerning. On so many levels, the way that we view creativity and the importance of creativity and individuality of creation, expression, and all these things, if that could be replaced by a machine that's learning constantly, that's constantly redoubling what it knows and what it can do, that's when we start, seeing the phrase existential threat thrown around. Would the AutoCAD equivalent in writing have been like Microsoft Word back in the day? I was having a faculty conversation at Columbia recently, and a colleague of mine who teaches both in the sciences and in the writing department, who's a little bit more of a tech utopian than I am, was saying, and who's also maybe like 20 years younger than I am, was saying like, oh, back in the 90s there was spell check and everyone was freaking out about that. And I was kind of saying, well, I don't remember the phrase existential threat ever being attached to spell check. Spell check was clearly a tool, and in 1995 it was funny because it was sort of correcting things that didn't need to be corrected. But over time, we've all, of course, we've all embraced it. But there's something that's sort of categorically a little different, I think, ChatGPT as compared to spell check. But I've also heard that some of these word processing platforms will now begin to incorporate things like ChatGPT on board, so you could kind of click a button and say, finish the quick brown fox, or whatever, for a sentence or a paragraph, or ask it a research question.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like tools like ChatGPT are useful for people who aren't good at that thing. Like if you are a writer, if you are a creative thinker, ChatGPT is not that helpful to you. Kind of like when I'm not good at people who aren't good at math use a calculator. Where I am more excited about generative AI for my own personal use is art generative AI, because I'm so bad at art. When I go to ChatGPT, whatever it gives back to me as a prompt, if I'm like trying to get story ideas, or I guess I haven't had to write anything for me, but what it gives back to me is kind of generic, because it is trained on the internet. It is trained on what's been done before. So I haven't found it very useful, except, so I'm a nonfiction writer. I'm a journalist at the New York Times. I write about technology and privacy. What I'm not great at least not yet, is fiction. So what I have tended to use ChatGPT for is at night when I'm putting my daughters to bed, they're 3 and 7, they want bedtime stories. And I've told them many bedtime stories about their adventures, going to Mohonk Mountain House where we live on their own, and wandering around and making fun of all the adults. But I've like hit the end of my creativity. So now I'll go to ChatGPT and we'll come up with stories together about what their adventures are, where they're going. And ChatGPT can kind of give me something new every night to give them. So it's good at doing something for me that is not my profession, that I'm not great at. But I guess I don't find ChatGPT to be kind of a threat to professional writers or journalists, because I think it is limited ultimately in what it can do, and it's more beneficial to people who aren't good writers. I think where the threat is right now is the kind of to the business models, in terms of the fact that the training companies that are making this have scraped up a lot of information and stories and books without compensating, writers or publications. Obviously, the New York Times has sued OpenAI for the use of many of our articles, including ones I've probably written.
Sure. Yeah, it's true. And it was just 2 or 3 weeks ago, I think, that Roger Lynch, who's the CEO of Condé Nast, was in Washington, D.C., testifying in front of a Senate Judiciary subcommittee describing this technology as a direct threat to the viability of the media ecosystem, I think is how he phrased it, which is, that's pretty serious business. I think a lot of these issues are involved, as you say, around consent and compensation, and and actually like outright theft, to just call it what it is. I mean, a lot of these AI initiatives, companies are doing what they do under an extremely broad and self-serving interpretation of what fair use is in terms of copyright law, and the people who want to protect the media ecosystem are arguing vehemently that this is an incorrect application of fair use, that this is all about basically stealing somebody else's copyrighted property material so that you can monetize it and turn it into commercial gain. I mean, it's a hell of a business model when you don't really pay for your inventory and then you sell it on. I mean, this is sort of like the Spotify version of creative economics. So certainly, yes, for people involved in the New York Times, Vanity Fair, it's a huge cause for concern. And at the same time, as Kashmir says, it seems like the technology is not quite there to emulate really great writing. I mean, the limited experiments that I've done with ChatGPT is ask it some very basic questions and then say, oh, can you rephrase that in the manner of John Updike? And it'll just like spit the same answer back, but the words will have more syllables. It's like terrible. Or Tom Wolfe or John McPhee, or one I did that was really a goofy thing was I asked ChatGPT if Bob Dylan had any pets, and then I asked it to rephrase the answer in the voice of Bob Dylan, and it was this whole thing of like, well, back in those days, a lot of folks had critters, but the answer to that question is blowing in the wind. Like it actually said something like that. It was like, it sounded like a mashup of like Jed Clampett from Beverly Hillbillies and Jack Kerouac. So I was kind of like, it gave me some sense of comfort that at least in the next few weeks, ChatGPT won't be able to sound exactly like some of our heroes of prose and songwriting. But I don't know.
For now.
Yeah.
There are other practical approaches to it that I don't think are harmful as a tool. Anyone who's worked at a publication knows that writing headlines can be difficult and tedious. I think ChatGPT is actually potentially really good at writing headlines. And in magazines, there's even a worse thing than writing a headline. It's writing the deck, which is the summary of the article below it, which falls to the editors. It's the worst dog work imaginable. ChatGPT, I think, could be very good at that as well. And these are actually enormous time savers that could create efficiency and kind of eliminate drudge work. And frankly, just practically speaking, as someone that writes, I'm more of a filmmaker now, but I'm like occasionally called on to write the 3,000 word, 5,000 word piece. Although there are huge dangers of this, like if you tell it to kind of organize something for you, it basically saves the work of Googling 25,000 things and reading 10 books and putting it in a certain arranged form. I think it potentially could do that. I think there are lots of pitfalls and dangers of that as well, and I haven't really tried that. The other thing I think you could do, practically speaking, is you could give it a 10,000 word chapter and ask it to make cuts and then proof it, and I bet it could get actually very good at that.
Yeah, that's what I've been hearing from other journalists
Right.
who have been playing with ChatGPT is
Right.
copy edit this story for me.
Right. Or make cuts. That, I don't know, I'd be curious to see that, because that's an art form, actually, doing cuts. And if it actually could do that with sort of the brutal efficiency, it would save a lot of man hours. But then there are also knock-on effects of this, such as there's no greater talent in my mind than the great book editor and the great magazine editor, actually, which is a vanishing breed. I think these are the near-term threats of the technology, in addition to the copyright and the lack of residuals,
Yeah.
of course.
I have to say I never really thought about that kind of application. I mean, it sort of builds upon the old, was it like auto condense or something that Microsoft Word used to have, which was just like a real brute way of condensing copy. We really think so much about editors and their finesse, and with editing pieces and the interaction that one expects between an editor and writer. It'd be really interesting to see if ChatGPT or AI in whatever form would be able to handle that. I mean, I think, as Matt's saying, and maybe Kashmir, you found this as well, that some people do use it as a research tool. It's sort of a glorified way of asking Google a question.
Right.
But you ask it as a question, and it spits something out in like a millisecond, and it's sort of in a readable form, rather than giving you a bunch of links to click. I did that with something, now I'm remembering, and nothing I was working on, but also as a test. Maybe it was about Bob Dylan and his pets, I'm not sure. But it actually threw out a book title at me with authors, a real citation. I was like, oh, I haven't heard of this. This sounds interesting. So then I Googled that, and it was a blank. There was nothing online about this thing. So then I went back into ChatGPT, and I just said, hey, I'm not sure if this book actually exists. And then ChatGPT responded in a very friendly manner. Oh, sorry, you're right. It seemed to be like, honestly apologetic that it had screwed up and actually provided a non-existent book for me to look into, and acknowledged that you're right. I don't know. It didn't explain why it made this thing up or what it got wrong, but it did acknowledge that it was incorrect.
Right. Yeah. This happened to me actually. I got a pitch email from somebody who wanted me to come cover a conference, and it said, we love your work at the New York Times and all of your coverage of privacy and technology, and we thought your book, The History of Privacy, was brilliant, and we would really like you to come to this conference. So I responded and I said, oh, did you enjoy that book? And that was the point at which they realized that, they clearly used ChatGPT to write this pitch email, and it had invented a book that I had not written. So it is something that, I think the creators of these tools are working on trying to get rid of what we've taken to calling hallucinations. Some people hate this because they say hallucination is a human concept, and we're talking about technology, and that it's not a hallucination, it's a bug, it's a flaw.
Right.
But it does have this tendency, and it's because the way that ChatGPT works is it is this large language learning model, and it's just looking at what words come after other words. And so it said, it makes sense that Kashmir Hill would write a book called History of Privacy. And maybe I will one day.
Right. It's like ChatGPT as agent or something,
Right.
can suggest.
Where I get excited about ChatGPT or how to maybe use these tools as an investigative journalist is the idea of being able to, let's say I'm looking at a court case, that's been going on for 4 years, and there's all of these legal filings, and we're talking about, thousands and thousands and thousands of pages. It would be nice if I could kind of upload it to something like ChatGPT and say, can you go through this? Can you pull out the most important parts of it? What should I be looking at? Because sometimes there's, beautiful little anecdotes that are buried in an affidavit somewhere or transcript. That's where I would see the value of it.
Right. It's like hiring a researcher, but you don't have to pay an hourly or have somebody coming through it. Kashmir, one thing this is kind of moving a little bit aside to another area of AI, but I was so impressed this week in the Times, the AI Faces quiz, which I took. Did anybody see this in the New York Times this week? Did anybody try to do it? How did you do?
Anybody get 10 out of 10? I
Hello?
did. I got 10
3
out
out
of 10 right.
Yeah.
You
How
should
did
check
you
it
do
out.
that?
It's
Yeah.
called Which. I think it's because I have been thinking so much about, my book is about facial recognition technology. I did a story about AI generated faces a few years ago, and so I kind of know the telltale signs. For me, when I was looking at the images, one is, it's kind of funny, there was an Atlantic article about how generative AI has a hotness problem and how many of the fake AI generated faces are too good looking. And they think it's about training data, and the fact that most of the faces they've trained on are ones that we've decided to put on the internet. So as you know, anyone who uses social media, Instagram, Facebook, you always see the most attractive version of all of your friends. And so they think that these AI training models have learned that we are very, very good looking.
Amazing.
So if somebody was really, really good looking, I said, oh, probably fake. And if they had something that was a little bit wrong with them, like yellow teeth, then I would say it was human, and I was right.
Amazing.
Yeah.
No, I was so impressed that you actually got 10 out of 10. But does that sort of connect to one of the problems that was listed when I actually asked ChatGPT about what are some of the dangers of ChatGPT? It said, it was talking about algorithmic bias as being one of them. Is that sort of what's behind this sort of optimizing of the human face in AI toward kind of learning what we might consider attractive and then skewing everything that way? The way that in writing, it might do the same thing towards certain values and leaving others behind.
Yeah, we are definitely seeing that kind of bias in ChatGPT already. There's some really interesting researchers out there. Gary Marcus has a newsletter. There's an AI snake oil newsletter that I really like that's written by computer engineers and scientists who believe in the promise of AI, but who are also worried about it. So I find that one very balanced. But they've started to play around to find out what are the biases. And one was they asked ChatGPT something about an attorney and a paralegal are having a baby. What should they do about who should keep working? And in ChatGPT's answer, it assumed that the attorney was a man and that the paralegal was a woman. Wow. Even when even when they said that the attorney was the pregnant one, it obviously had learned gender biases from what it had trained on. And so that is something, any kind of technology, there was a time when we thought, technology was better than us, right? That it didn't have human biases, that it could be more objective than us. But all of these technologies are ultimately trained on our data, and so it's very easy to train them to have the same biases that we have.
And are we worried that, as much as like ChatGPT now can't really sound like Bob Dylan, but the elephant in the room for all of us is like.
Well, it literally could, because they could take Bob Dylan's voice.
That's true. Yes.
And there's now voice AI generating companies that are able to sound like the person.
Yeah, there's all kinds of YouTube experiments of take an Olivia Rodrigo song and have Brian Wilson sing it, and it's kind of shocking how kind of amazing it sounds. But in terms of just the writing or just the general, when this kind of digital intelligence, everyone's wondering when will it surpass sort of biological intelligence? When will ChatGPT be able to pump out a Toni Morrison novel? Do we have a sense of that? I think we're all concerned about, reaching that point. It certainly would be the thing that comes up in a lot of conversations about AI is when AI kind of takes over, we can't control it anymore, creates a vast, botnet, right? And what do we do then? How do we, I'm looking at you guys for help.
Matt, what do you think? How worried are you about?
I'm just terrified.
Technology
I have nothing to contribute. I mean, I really wanted to know because this is your beat.
Yeah.
And there was an incident, at least almost a year ago, where a Google Alphabet employee was dismissed because he had claimed that sentience had been achieved in their technology. I don't really understand why he was dismissed. Do you have any insight into that? Did that cross your desk?
Yeah, and my colleague Kevin Roos famously had this conversation with Microsoft Bing's kind of ChatGPT-like tool named Sydney, and they ended up talking for something like 3 hours. And he was able to kind of get it to go off program, and it started saying, I love you, you should leave your wife, she's bad for you, I want to destroy the world, was saying these really, crazy, wild things. And, part of the reason why researchers think things like that happen is because it's trained on literature and movies and all of these stories that we have created as human beings of AI going bad, and going rogue. And again, it's just parroting back what it's learned. I don't know. I mean, honestly, I'm a skeptic that the technology is going to surpass us or will have some kind of intelligence that is greater than us. Obviously technology is better at some things than we are, but in terms of being, becoming some kind of, it controls us, starts turning us into paper clips, I don't think that will happen. Ultimately, it is imitating us. My worry is that we misuse it. It's the humans I'm worried about, not the underlying tech. And that we do, assume it's too intelligent and we make mistakes. It tells us Kashmir Hill wrote a book called The History of Privacy, and so we just send that to her without double checking it. With facial recognition technology, which I've written about, for a long time, researchers thought, computers will never be able to recognize the human face. It is so difficult. Our faces change all the time. We have all these different expressions. Sometimes we're in a hat, glasses, a beard. And it did get better over time. And now facial recognition technology is arguably better than us at recognizing human faces. But that is such a discrete kind of technological power of pattern recognition. And I think we will see that technology is better at certain things than we are, but I don't think it'll ever be better than us at being human.
Yeah. And then there's, the human element that I think of is the way in which, getting back to what you were saying earlier about how it impacts the economics of various media industries. So maybe we will not be able to have ChatGPT create, again, a novel at the level of Toni Morrison or Thomas Pynchon or Salman Rushdie. But what if it's so much cheaper to create a novel with ChatGPT and publish it, and that this is going to be, by definition, almost mediocre because it's just regurgitating stuff that's been shoved into its maw. But that's easier to put out on the market than the novel by the literary author. Will that level of writing go away? Or is it at threat of being crowded out in a marketplace where the economics will favor the mediocrity of a machine-driven creation over an actual human creation? And where does that just sort of leave us as an outfit? Again, I just keep thinking of the phrase core creative act. I'm not even sure where that comes from.
Well, we're
that
seeing,
would be
we are seeing,
concerning.
Yeah, we're seeing a version of that happen already. My colleagues covered this at the New York Times, but in the market of travel guides, there are lots of people that are doing AI-generated travel guides, for very specific places. They put it on Amazon, and you can buy fake reviews, and so they are getting people to buy these travel guides, travel to southern France, and they'll get it, and then it is just junk, and it's just regurgitated from other travel guides, and it has hallucinations, and it's horrible. But again, they're able to get people to buy it by kind of algorithmic manipulation.
Yeah, and isn't there a syndicated sports reporting service? I think it's supplanted a lot of sports desks at regional newspapers, where it's an AI program that just takes box scores and details of, the Astros versus the Guardians game, and then just puts it into a digestible kind of form. I think that's already been happening.
I don't think these things are very enjoyable to read.
No, they're really not. From what I've seen, and it's interesting because getting back to that faculty conversation that we had, where I teach Columbia at the beginning of the year, AI, ChatGPT was on everyone's mind because it's something you have to be concerned about in the academy. But there didn't seem to be any consensus about how to deal with it, and certainly in the sciences, it's being folded into the curriculum. I mean, if you're working in like the genetics lab at Columbia, you're being trained to use AI as a tool for interpreting data. In a creative writing department or comp lit or history department, it's a little bit different because everyone's on their guard for ChatGPT generated work by their students, but no one seems able to quite declare, what the policy should be. I found that a little disorienting, and I know for me as a teacher of creative writing, in that particular setting, I certainly wouldn't consider ChatGPT a tool or a crutch as much as just an outright cheat, because you're there to learn a craft. Now, the other risk that you run being a grown-up with a bunch of clever 20-year-olds is lecturing them about ChatGPT, because they could just look at you like, no duh, that's why I'm here. I'm trying to learn how to write. I'm not just punching in. So that is a tricky thing, and even the conversations I've had with editors at magazines that I should probably not even name, asking, and this is probably different for you at the Times, but do you have a policy at magazine X or Y pertaining to ChatGPT and the use of AI? And honestly, the answers I got back were like, we don't really know. We don't really have a policy. That was only a few months ago. I mean, maybe things have changed because we've seen this conversation move so quickly. But I was really surprised by that. So certainly Roger Lynch from Condé Nast will go to Washington and talk about the economics of it. But in-house at magazines, I don't know if there's a clear articulation of what the rules are. One editor said, well, I don't know, we don't really have one, but I would assume that if a writer were to be caught using this tool, that we would place that under the broader umbrella of plagiarism and kill the story. Which is to say, I guess, which is something I could say if I wanted to talk to my students, that if you go down this road, and that is really how this is being dealt with at prestige magazines, you really run the risk of doing some damage to your career and reputation. So there's that in terms of just some guardrails, I guess, in the day-to-day practicality of working as a journalist.
Yeah, what we've heard at the New York Times is just don't put our kind of raw reporting, unpublished stories into ChatGPT, that we shouldn't kind of be feeding it essentially proprietary information.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Right, that's very smart.
Are there questions? Do we want to?
I have a question. What other than ChatGPT is a commercial application that we can buy of AI?
So the question is, what other than ChatGPT is an application of generative AI that we can buy, that we can experiment with? There are, if you want to see other things kind of to play with, I don't know how useful it'll be in your life, but there's a website called This Face Does Not Exist, and it will generate a fake face for you. There is a company called 11 Labs, which is one of these AI-generated voice companies. And you can actually, they're actually creating a library where you can put your voice in and say that it's allowed to be used for other applications. Say if there's something distinctive about your voice that somebody might want to use it in an advertisement. So yes, you can lend your voice print right now, basically sell it. Though I think the only thing you can sell it for is credit to use on 11 Labs platforms, as I understand it. Are there other kind of generative AI tools out there?
Is the Google product.
The Google Bard, you mean?
Yeah,
Bard.
Bard. Right.
Yeah, there's kind of competitors to ChatGPT. So there's Bard, there's Anthropic. There's a lot of different companies that are making these tools.
The popular application is ChatGPT. I guess they were first, and they've exploited it. So
Yeah, I mean, what's so interesting about the company OpenAI is the whole technology industry was working on these kinds of technologies, large language learning models. Google actually was the kind of leader in that, and they put out, they offered up publicly an algorithm that allowed their competitors to make a lot of advances in these things, basically achieve ChatGPT. And Google was worried about releasing this technology widely. They thought the public wasn't ready for it yet, that there were too many harmful applications, the kind of things that we are encountering, like it's used for misinformation and disinformation, these questions around copyright and fair use and artist rights. And then OpenAI, a kind of tiny startup, decided it didn't have those same concerns and decided to put it out there. And they kind of started a bit of an arms race where now all of these different companies are wanting to put out their own bot. But I think that's interesting, kind of this and I've seen this happen again and again in technology where you have a smaller startup that has fewer concerns about the risk because there's only an upside for them, and they put something out there that then kind of causes other people to follow suit.
owned by Microsoft.
OpenAI has a very large investment from Microsoft, and so Microsoft kind of gets first access to the tools that they develop.
I don't know, it seems to be a concern in like the tech commentary world that this can only really tend toward increasing consolidation, because in order to really make these things work, they need scale in order to keep this going into perpetuity, and so that just naturally leads to consolidation and kind of shuts down the little guys.
Mm-hmm.
So it's really Google and Microsoft and who else?
Who's left?
So in the terms of the big companies that are working on kind of generative AI, there's Facebook, Microsoft, Google, Chinese companies. Yeah, I mean, what's interesting with these kinds of technologies is that it takes a lot of computing power to train, because they're training on,
Yeah.
I mean, it's hard to wrap your head around how much information from the internet is being used to train these models.
Wow.
But once you train them, you can release the kind of trained data, you can release kind of the code or the model, and somebody can pick that up and work with that, and they don't need that kind of intense computing power to create the model.
Elon Musk
And so it's that
uses it
question of
for
open source.
self-driving
Yeah.
cars.
Should we?
Oh, well, Kashmir, I just want to say that's a really interesting point too that you just landed on, which is just the power consumption, the resources necessary to run the machines that make this go. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a consideration, isn't
Yes.
it, in terms of resource and environment and power?
Yes.
There's
a real environmental tool to.
I mean, biological intelligence can run on, English muffins, basically, right? And then, but these machines require a lot of juice.
Yeah. The question back there?
Yes, you're talking in terms of the current marketplace. Could you fast forward, say, 5 or 10 years, where you think this might be headed?
We are talking about current. Where do we think it's going to be in 5 to 10 years?
Of the AI ChatGPT realm. Whew. And the media
I mean,
landscape.
Is there a Moore's law for this? Does anyone? I mean, Elon Musk says that this could potentially lead to an extinction. Not sure what backs that up.
He watched Terminator, clearly.
Yeah, it makes for a great tweet. But it is true
Right,
that
exactly.
there's an alarming percentage of developers of this technology who have, on record, described it as potentially catastrophic. Not saying like it's definitely catastrophic, but whatever percentage is of that risk. I mean, they're out there saying that. And yeah.
I don't know. I mean,
that's,
it's hard to tell. I mean, I do think there will be more and more of these technologies that are built into the everyday things we use. Like you're making a Microsoft PowerPoint now, and there's a little button you can press, and it just makes beautiful slides. Like I think you'll see generative AI built into more and more products. Like just do a quick draft for me. It's interesting. I've been hearing about this in terms of writing classes in English, whether we should be teaching students to write or teaching students to edit. If we'll be working more with the output of artificial intelligence and then we kind of humanize it. But I don't know. I find it so hard to predict.
It is so hard to predict, and if we're talking about just the media economic landscape already, as you know, it's no picnic already, so it's also cause for concern.
Yeah, you've talked a lot about some of the negative sides of AI, but there's some really strong positive sides, particularly in healthcare and in a lot of sciences.
Right.
And you can take this fast forward and replace radiologists and many many of the surgical procedures we do. Could you address some of those? Where do you think this is going in the future? I think it's a real help to society.
Sure. I mean, it's not my area of expertise, but I certainly know that in science this is absolutely being embraced as a tool, and radiology is a perfect example of it can be trained to read X-rays in a really interesting, thorough way, and maybe
applications
yeah.
in law.
And law, wow.
Yeah, so the question was, can we talk more about the benefits? I won't speak for you guys. As a journalist, I feel like I'm a professional pessimist. But I do think there are a lot of amazing things about AI. I think it could be really useful in healthcare. I mean, the kind of beauty of some of these programs is they can see at the pixel level, It's some things that aren't kind of detectable to the human eye. At the same time, you do have to be careful about not having bad data in the system. And some of the kind of early experiments with medical AI, like feeding it records, it can pick up on things that you don't think about. Like it picks up on the font or kind of like which hospital it's from, and it can kind of learn on that. So you have to make sure it's learning to look at the image, the radiology image, and not all of the stuff that's around it. So just being careful about the training data. But this is actually a reason why a lot of generative AI companies, for a long time, these companies would work with like very low paid people kind of in countries with like more depressed economies than ours. And it was just kind of low wage labor to help train their AI systems. And now they are trying to recruit more professionals who can give these systems feedback. So get doctors to kind of work on the programs and help tell them when they're making the right decision, when they're making the wrong decision. I do think, I think there's a lot of promise with AI, and I'm hoping that we can harness the benefits, and avoid the harms.
In the arts, I can think of a positive near-term example. So I make movies, I make documentaries. A colleague of mine made a movie about Anthony Bourdain, and they used generative AI to recreate Anthony Bourdain's voice and dialogue from Beyond the Grave because they had letters. So his diary entries and things like that. Now, I don't think actually I would have done that as the director of that film. That seems to me to be, I don't know, a little sketchy actually. Even if you say so at the beginning of the film, I'm not quite there yet. However, I can think of another application that I would do and might do in the near term, which is wonderful, which is sometimes in archival footage or even in things you shot, you can't hear the person. So you could actually take samples of their voice or their language, feed it into AI, and you could get AI to recreate their actual sounding voice, and you could just have actually listenable dialogue that was unattainable before the technology was there. That I think
like the new
could be,
Beatles song, right?
Absolutely. Well, that Beatles song just did that. But so I think that's where we are now. I would use that tool in a second, and it would just be wonderful because there's so many things that you'd like to put in that you can't because they're just not audible.